Okay, I want to start out with a brief story that is also a true story. A few weeks ago, after the worship team got done practicing on a Wednesday night, a vocalist who volunteers on our team, she came up to me and said, "Hey, so I've been reading the New Testament during December, during the Advent season, and I've read Matthew, and I've read Mark, and I'm halfway through Luke. Why do I feel like I'm reading the same thing over and over and over again?" And it's an excellent question. Why do we feel like we're often reading the same story over and over again in different parts of the Bible, especially in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And so what I offered to my friend to try to give her just a different angle to look for is to, yes, notice all the similarities, but also to notice the little differences that sometimes really matter. And here's what I mean by that. Often, different gospel authors, they tell the same stories, but they're trying to make slightly different points with that same story that each one is telling. And so they'll emphasize little details differently, or they'll maybe include some other characters that another gospel author doesn't. And those differences, what gets included, what doesn't get included, can often be little hints that help us understand why is this gospel author telling this story and what is their point. So we're gonna do that with Matthew 2 today. And I'm gonna point out several features that are in the Jesus' birth story that are only in Matthew. And then I'm gonna suggest, just from the details in the text, what I think that Matthew's getting at. What is the gospel according to Matthew at the birth of Jesus? And where I think we're gonna land, and again, you guys can kind of track with me in the next 25 minutes or so and see what you think, but where I think we land is what Matthew is trying to claim is that Jesus at his birth is the King of the universe, the perfect embodiment of God's people, and that he's a new and greater Moses who's gonna lead God's people into deliverance, freedom, restoration. I think those are the unique claims that Matthew in particular is making in his birth story of Jesus. And we're gonna dive into all of that in just a moment. So you may have noticed in this series, we have been vacillating week by week. We're preaching on Matthew, then we're preaching on Luke, then we're preaching on Matthew, then we're preaching in Luke again. There is a reason for that. It's because if any one of us, myself included, got asked just kind of at random, "Hey, can you tell me the Christmas story? Tell me the birth of Jesus story." I'm pretty sure every one of us would give a conflated telling where we blend stuff from Matthew and some from Luke together and probably not realize we're doing it. Again, this gets back to my points of what are the certain things that Matthew includes versus what Luke includes and why. Okay, so here's just kind of rapid fire, a quick list of things that are only in Matthew at the birth of Jesus story or only in Luke. And then we're gonna look at the Matthew details today. So, ready, Janet? An angel only visits Mary in Luke. An angel only visits Joseph in Matthew. An angel only visits shepherds in Luke. The Magi only visit Jesus in Matthew. A census prompts Jesus' family to take a trip to Bethlehem only in Luke. And Jesus' family is found in a house in Bethlehem rather than in a stable, only in Matthew. So in my mind, those two sets of things are all just kind of merged and blended together. But if we really look at what is Matthew trying to get across and what is Luke trying to get across, we say, oh, there's some things that are only in Matthew that I would have just assumed were in Mark, Luke, and John, right? So let's lean into Matthew chapter 2 here. And before we jump in, if this piques your curiosity, I want to toss this out. There are resources for you guys along these lines. This is the CSB's Harmony of the Gospels that actually put the different gospel stories that are parallels on the same page in columns right next to each other, which makes it super easy to see those similarities that we're talking about and those crucial differences. And then there's even some like extra little helping notes around it that help explain, here's why we think Matthew has included this and Luke has included this. So there are resources out there to help you guys study the Gospels like this and try to discern the message in these stories if that is of interest to you. So let's jump into Matthew chapter 2. And just a reminder, if you see a part that is underlined on the screen, that is your part. Please read that aloud. So we're going to start with verses 1 through 3. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?" When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed. Okay, excellent. So this is where we're kind of starting off today. And there's three aspects or characters in these first verses that I want to clarify. Herod, the star, and the Magi. Okay? So let's begin with Herod. Herod the First, or Herod the Great. This is not the emperor of Rome, and he's not like of royal lineage. He is just a dude who over many years has worked his way up in power in the Roman Empire because he has just been relentlessly pro-Rome. Whatever Rome wants, Herod's like, I'm your guy. Whatever I can do to kind of raise my status in the empire, I'll do it. So he's worked himself into a place of power by being severely loyal to the empire. And he reigned for 33 years. And when Jesus is born, it's near the end of his reign. He dies in 4 BC, and Jesus is born before he dies. So he is probably into around his 30th year of reign. And his later years, Herod's later years, as he's governing this kind of province or region where a lot of the Jews are living, where Jerusalem is, where Bethlehem is, Herod's last years were marked by emotional and psychological deterioration. He became very violent, very rash in his decisions, to the point where there was one time where he had set up a statue, and two Pharisees, two Jewish leaders who were like experts in the Bible and were helping other people worship God, these two Pharisees, they come and pull the statue down, and Herod burns them alive for that. So that's the kind of guy we're talking about. And that's going to make some sense of some things that happen in the latter parts of Matthew chapter 2. So that's Herod, the star. There is a thing or a theme in the ancient world where in really important royal figures are associated with either the arrival of a star or following a star. So, a couple of examples. Legend has it that when Alexander the Great was born, that this bright star came up in the sky. In Virgil's classic ancient Greek epic, the Aeneid, a star leads the founder of Rome to the location where Rome is going to be built. And in Numbers 24, we have the anticipation of a royal king who is described as a star who's going to arise and rule over the nations. So to us, it kind of feels foreign or odd. It's like, why is there a random star that's just popped up? Like, was it a comet? We try to like rewind the clock in the stars and be like, what was this actually? But in the ancient world, there's like, yeah, stars and kings. Like that's a thing. We know what to do with that. So there's a quote that I really appreciated from a New Testament scholar, Donald Hagner. And I believe that'll be on the screens. And he says this. He concludes that these ancient parallels show that Matthew's narrative of the stars that arrives when Jesus is born was not as alien to his age as it is to ours. We may allow for some indirect influence of these other parallels in the ancient world upon Matthew's formulation of his narrative without concluding that it therefore contains nothing historical. So I like his balance here. Hagner's basically saying like, yeah, people in the ancient world, this makes sense to them. They would know what to do with this. It's a theme, it's a thing, but that doesn't mean that it didn't really happen for Jesus. It just means that an ancient person would have known, like, yeah, oh, look at that. There's a new star that's really bright in the sky. I wonder if a king has been born. And we're going to see that some ancient magi thought exactly that. So these magi, they're often called wise men, but the more specific term is magi, so I'll be using that today. A couple of misnomers to clear up. The gospel according to Matthew never says there was 3 and never says that they were kings, which kind of calls into question every single aspect of We Three Kings. These are aspects of tradition reflecting on the story. So these magi brought 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so the conclusion was, well, maybe there's 3, and maybe they're kings. Maybe not. We don't know. So unknown number, unknown if they're royalty or not, but they are magi. Now, magi means a certain thing in the ancient world. A magi was somebody who was typically an advisor to royalty, and particularly far east of Jerusalem. So if we think about Babylon, we think about Persia, these great emperors that ruled, they would have groups of magi that advised them, that read the stars for them, that understood the natural world, that had different ways of discerning which directions they thought the king, or the emperor, should be going. So if you kind of think about what Daniel does in the book of Daniel, for those of us that have read Daniel, and Daniel has this kind of showdown at sometimes with these other advisors to the kings, and they're like interpreting dreams and kind of going back and forth, and Daniel shows them all up, he's better. But that is the sort of thing that a magi would do. That's magi stuff, okay? So these magi, these wise people who know how to read the natural world and discern wisdom from it, they look up and they say, whoa, a king has been born, and they travel a long ways. I believe we have a map. I want to show you guys. So we don't know exactly where they came from, but on your guys' left side here, we have Jerusalem right on the coast of the Mediterranean there. And then way over east in roughly modern day Iran is probably where these guys travel from. And this is a many-month journey. So we're going to see in just a minute in chapter 2 of Matthew, it's the Magi are talking like Jesus. They're expecting Jesus to possibly be about 2 years old, because that's how long they've been following this star. That's when they first noticed it appearing. So these guys come a super long way because coming from way out in the east, from other nations and other empires, they look and say, whoa, there's been a king that has been born. Now, the Magi, they're going to assume that a king is going to be born in the capital city, because they go to Jerusalem. Was Jesus born in Jerusalem? No. But it's a reasonable assumption, right? Like, hey, there's a king that's been born in this area. Let's go to the capital city and see what's up. The sad thing about them going there is that they alert Herod the Great, who, as we just saw, is bordering on being a crazy person, that there is a king that has been born. And how do you think Herod, who has fought and clawed his way into a significant amount of prestige and power and control and wealth, how's he going to respond to the news of, hey, there's a new king that's been born in your backyard? Probably not so well. And so the text says that he was greatly disturbed. He's greatly disturbed. He probably doesn't want to have a ruckus be caused in his province. He's trying to keep things orderly and neat and peaceful because he wants the emperor to be like, man, that Herod guy's doing a great job. Let's, give him his funding. Let's make sure that we take care of this guy. So Herod's not wanting, a rival king born in his backyard. So he's troubled by this. So these details about these magi and they're following the star and Herod's reaction that are emphasized in Matthew chapter 2. Why is that there? What is that telling us? Here's what I think. I think the heavens, the star, right? And this will be on the screen. The heavens and the nations represented by these magi perceive and celebrate the advent or arrival of a great king, but the corrupted ruler in the Roman Empire reacts violently to this news. So the heavens themselves and the nations all around recognize a great king has been born, and we've perceived that and we're going to celebrate that. Rome, the representatives of this massive empire, they respond in violence. That might threaten me. And so we're going to see what Herod does here in just a minute. But I think what these claims make about Jesus for Matthew is that for the gospel according to Matthew, Herod the governor is not king. Even the Caesar Augustus, who's ruling at that time, is not king. But you know who is king? Jesus the Messiah. And the heavens recognize that, and the nations recognize that, okay? Let's move on to verses 4-8 here. When he had called together all the peoples, that is the Jewish chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judah, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. Put a note in that, we're gonna come back to that. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me. Is that what Herod wants to do? No, I don't think we're supposed to believe a word he's saying right now. So, kind of just breaking down the sequence of events really quick. Herod, he calls in the Pharisees, the temple leaders, the people who know their Bible, which is what we call the Old Testament, better than any of us ever will. And they're like, hey, experts, where, according to your scriptures, is a king of the Jews going to be born? And they reply by quoting from the book of Micah, from the prophet Micah, chapter 5, verse 2, which I believe is on the screen for you guys. So you can just see how similarly these experts in the Bible more or less quote 2/3 of this to Herod. And they're like, yeah, we have a source for this. We know where the king is going to be born. And then what Herod does is he then brings the Magi back in. He's like, all right, I got my information. Now, Magi, come back. Guys, go find the king. And also, when did you first start seeing the star? Because he wants to know how old the baby is going to be at that time. And then he's like, hey, come back and tell me when you find him because I want to worship him. Which, again, if we're knowing who Herod is, we're kind of like looking at him side-eye like, no, you don't, man. Like, whatever you're planning on is not good. So that's kind of the sequence of events there. And if we dig into the context of Micah 5:2 for just a second here, the surrounding parts of the book of Micah 5:2 isn't just in a vacuum, right? It's in a whole book. And if we look at this king who's going to be born, who is anticipated in Micah 5, this king is in contrast with all the really bad rulers who are in Israel and Judah at that time. And so if you're Herod, and you're a bad ruler, and this anticipated Messiah who's going to arrive is going to basically get rid of you guys to bring in peace and justice, again, Herod is right to be greatly disturbed if his goal is to maintain power and control and keep doing bad things and taxing the poor for the sake of the empire and things like that. Okay? So, that is where we're at. And again, by quoting Micah 5 and this Micah's hope for an idealized, Micah seems to be blending the Messiah and God himself here. We get the sense of this Jesus is king. Herod, you can react in whatever way you want. You're not king. The Caesar Augustus himself is not king. Jesus is the king. And then in verses 9-12, after they had heard the king, they being the Magi, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So the Magi, they continue to follow the star. They're like, oh, redirect. Wasn't actually in the capital, wasn't in Jerusalem. We got to go over to this smaller town, to Bethlehem. We'll find the king that we've been searching for there. And then this is not the first time, nor the last time, in the gospel according to Matthew, that dreams, divine dreams, pop in and warn the people in the story about, hey, this bad thing's about to happen. So, do go by this route instead. So we're going to see that happen to Joseph here in just a second. So they give Jesus and his family these gifts. They return by another route. And these gifts might be just the perfect, timely thing. Because what Joseph, Mary, and Jesus are going to have to do in the next verses is flee the country. They need to get out of Dodge right now because an angel comes to Joseph in a dream and says, hey, you guys are about to be in significant danger. So if you're a lower middle class working craftsman in the ancient Near East, you don't have a bunch of money just sitting aside for a quick waltz down to Egypt whenever you feel like it. So the receiving of these expensive gifts from these magi at this moment might be just the perfect thing to fund the flight to Egypt that they're about to have to undergo. So let's look at verses 13 through 16. And just to remind you guys, the thing that I said at the beginning, I think that Matthew's claiming that Jesus is the great king. We've emphasized that so far as we've worked through the text. The other two things had to do with Jesus being the perfect representative of God's people and being a new and greater Moses who's going to bring a new Exodus-style deliverance. We're now going to get into that side of things, okay? So verses 13 through 16. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said. "Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So that's the first we've heard of that, and we now know that we were right in not really trusting Herod when he's like, oh, I want to come worship him, right? So Joseph, got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And here we have another quotation of a prophet from the Old Testament. "And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet." We'll come back to that. "When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time that he had learned from the Magi when they started to see the star." Obviously horrific stuff. The exact number of innocent baby boys who would have been killed in this incident, we don't know for sure. Bethlehem wasn't a huge town, and so if we're talking 2-year-olds and under, we're talking about probably 50 or less. So it's not like, thousands and thousands, but one is too many, obviously, and so this is horrible. And again, this is why we sang the song we did earlier that blends Christmas hope and some of the hardships of the Christmas story and this time of year together. But there are 3 layers or angles of Exodus stuff going on in these verses that I want to tease out because, again, I think it's core to what Matthew's trying to get across. First, what you guys read, Hosea 11:1, if we can get that on the screen. "When Israel was a child, a young people, a young nation, I loved him." And then what you guys read, "Out of Egypt I've called my son." So Hosea 11:1 is not like, oh, we're going to foretell Jesus having to run to Egypt. Hosea is looking retrospectively at the Exodus event and how God delivered the nation of Israel from the Exodus. But when Jesus has to run to Egypt and then later gets to come back from Egypt, the author Matthew's mind goes to, there was another time that happened with the whole nation in the Exodus event. And I think this is important to lean into a little bit here, because with what Matthew is doing, he's making Jesus represent Israel. Israel went down to Egypt and came back in a crisis. Jesus had to go down to Egypt and come back. So Jesus is taking on the role. He's representing the nation of Israel. And Israel, they spent generations, decades in slavery as a landless, people experiencing insecurity, marginalization, oppression. Jesus, in his sojourn to Egypt, relives that national story as the people's representation. So I want to tease this out, and this will be on the screens. Jesus became a foreign immigrant and relives the hardship of ancient Israel, who lived as foreign immigrants for generations in Egypt. I think this is an easy point to gloss by without letting this sink in. This is a big deal all through the scriptures. So we go all the way back to the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. After these Exodus events happen, God tells Israel over and over again, hey, take care of the sojourner, take care of the immigrant, take care of the foreigner. Why? Because you yourself were once an immigrant, a foreigner, a sojourner. You know what it's like to be marginalized, to have insecurity. So treat people like that with compassion and generosity. And furthermore, the Exodus only happens in the first place because the God of Israel, the creator of the heavens and the earth, heard the cry of an oppressed people group under the thumb of an empire, right? Israel is just this tiny little bit of the population in Egypt. They're being oppressed, they're being enslaved, they're being mistreated. And it turns out the cry of people in that kind of situation, God hears that and that moves God to action. That's what the Exodus deliverance is. And so this is a big deal to God. It's these details in the text that we need to allow to form us as we study it. And this is actually exactly the point that last week Josh Tandy, he came as a guest preacher. He shared this kind of main takeaway idea when he was talking about the angels. They're singing not to the rulers, not to the wealthy, not to the elites. They go to shepherds in middle of nowhere, right? His point was the good news of Christmas and the gospel is for everyone. Everyone. Bring you good news that will be for all people, right? Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you, Jesus Christ the Lord. If the gospel isn't good news for all people, it's not good news. And that's the beautiful thing about these narratives is they really do emphasize, both in Luke and in Matthew, but in different ways, again, that the good news of the arrival of Jesus, the great King, is not an exclusivist Israel good news. It is a good news for those magi way the heck out east who are in another people group serving other empires. It is good news for all people. So that is kind of part one of this Exodus stuff, is Jesus as this perfect representative of God's people. He plays out and represents Israel as they go into Egypt and come back. Second, if we're thinking about Exodus stuff around the time of Moses, and we think about Herod responding to, you know what we need to do? We need to kill a bunch of little boys that are Hebrews to protect the power of our empire. Who does that remind us of in Exodus? The Pharaoh, doesn't it? The Pharaoh. And this is one of the interesting things in the Hebrew Bible is that, and into the New Testament, of course, too, as we get to Herod, empires consistently react with violence and death when their power is threatened. It's what Egypt does. It's what Assyria does. It's what Babylon does. It's what Greece does. It's what Rome does. It's just what empire does. They will act in great violence and go to great lengths and take out whoever they need to keep control and power. And this is part of the good news of the gospel, because Jesus is not just he became a lowly savior, but the message in Matthew that we're seeing is Jesus is also the great king who has an alternative kingdom, an alternative way of ruling in the world, an alternative way of wielding power that does not lash out against the vulnerable when threatened. In fact, Jesus' message, the message of his kingdom, is that it is through sacrificial love that looks like weakness. That is where real power actually resides. So that is the great alternative of Jesus' kingdom to guys like Pharaoh and Herod, who will do anything they need to anyone to keep what they think is theirs. So that's our second angle on Exodus stuff, is we have Herod the Great acting just like the Pharaoh, who threw baby Hebrew boys into the Nile, and Herod has commands that baby Hebrew boys be put to death, because that is what empires do in the Bible. We're going to read a little bit more text, and then we're going to come back to our third angle or layer of Exodus stuff going on here. So verses 17 through 20. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. And that's weeping and grieving in response to the death of these baby boys. After Herod died, so we're fast forwarding in time a couple years, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel." Okay, great. Unfortunately, we will not have time to get into the quote from Jeremiah here. That's its own really interesting thing in itself. But we will get into the very last thing you guys read. For those who are trying to take the child's life are dead. This is almost verbatim, straight out of the story of Moses. So you guys might recall, Moses, he grows up, becomes a 40-year-old dude. He sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating an Israelite, commits murder. He's like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. I got to run into the desert, runs out there. And then after a while, God encounters him and says, "Hey, Moses, those who are trying to kill you are dead." Verbatim, what this vision, the message of this vision is to Joseph. So again, we're likening now Jesus specifically to Moses, only instead of Moses being in the wrong because he killed somebody and had to run, Jesus has done nothing wrong but has his life under threat. So Jesus is not only similar to Moses, he's greater than, better than Moses. And here's the thing, these Exodus themes and vibes and allusions that we're picking up, these don't just stop in chapter 2 of Matthew. So if we look in chapter 2 of Matthew, what we've seen is that after Jesus, like Israel, departs from Egypt in chapter 2, right, that's what happens. In chapter 3, Jesus goes through his baptismal waters, similar to Israel going through the waters of the Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea in the Exodus event. In chapter 4 of Matthew, Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness. Israel spends 40 years in the wilderness. And in Matthew 5, Jesus goes up on a mountain to give a new Torah, a new law, just like Moses goes up Sinai and gives the people law. So this is, in other words, a consistent strategy of the gospel according to Matthew is Jesus is like Moses, but he's even better. And in case you guys are wondering, like, is Matthew me just making this up? There is, in fact, many different people who have looked at the Gospel of Matthew closely who have picked up on exactly this, to the point where there's, I believe, a slide that has a study. There's some entire books who all that their goal is to do is to show how Jesus is a new Moses in the book of Matthew. This is very much a thing. It is part of the way that Matthew has chosen to tell his gospel, his good news about Jesus. So I think it's fair asking why. If this is something that Matthew does intentionally, repeatedly over numerous chapters, why? What did the first Moses and his Exodus accomplish? I think it accomplished freedom for an oppressed immigrant population, like we've already talked about. And it accomplished the creation of national Israel and their covenant with God. So Israel, they're kind of an oppressed small people group. Through the Exodus event and then the covenant that they make with Yahweh, that is their becoming a nation. Becoming more than just a small people group, they're becoming a nation that have a covenant with their God. That is what Moses accomplished through his Exodus. Well, then if we ask, what will Jesus' new Exodus accomplish? If they're similar, but Jesus' is even better, I think there's still an aspect of Jesus' kingdom that we've already talked about, where what Jesus accomplishes in his new Exodus is freedom and justice for all of creation. We read that, fine ladies here read that in the Advent candle liturgy for us, right? That the hope of Jesus' return, when he brings his kingdom back in full, that there will be peace and justice that covers all the earth. Moses did that in one little moment in time for one group of people. The kingdom of God is on a much larger trajectory to do that for the whole cosmos, for all of creation. That is our hope. That is what we believe. It also, in a more spiritual sense, brings freedom from slavery to sin and death. So you can think, probably many of you guys have passages from Paul's letters popping into your heads right now, maybe particularly Romans and things like that. But part of the Exodus way that Jesus leads his people through is, hey, you don't have to be enslaved to sin and death anymore. I'm going to do a new creation in you that gives you a different way of living outside of slavery to sin and death. And then lastly, God recreates his people in resurrection life. So Israel was kind of created through the waters of the Exodus and brought from slavery to freedom. Jesus does something similar with his people, but in a much grander scale and in a much more permanent and lasting way. So I think that is why Matthew goes to such great lengths and so consistently presents Jesus, the great king, as both the representative of Israel and as a new and greater Moses, who's going to lead a new and greater deliverance event. I like the way that the scholar David Capes says this. He says, the return of Joseph and Mary and Jesus to the land of Abraham, to their home, causes Matthew to think of the rescue of God's people from its first exile as slaves in Egypt. He thus introduces a new Old Testament feature to his gospel. Like Moses, when Jesus grows up, he will rescue his people. Unlike Israel, Jesus is God's son who returns from exile in Egypt, not to ultimately break the covenant with God his Father, but to perfectly do the will of his Father. The saving event known in the Hebrew scriptures as the Exodus is now refracted through this new lens, the birth, life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Hold off on that slide for just a second, please, Janet. Appreciate you. So, all these connections between how Matthew's presenting Jesus and the Exodus event in Moses, they're so repeated, they're so prominent in how Matthew chooses to tell his version of the good news of the gospel that we could call this a narrative analogy where characters and events are being linked. We're invited to compare Jesus with Moses. We're invited to compare Herod with Pharaoh. There's analogies between these characters and events. And this is a primary way in which biblical authors create meaning in their stories. They're constantly shaping their stories so that it's linking to other stories. And that's where a lot of the meat of these narratives is in doing those comparisons and then determining what's the similarities, but what are the differences, and what kind of message does that create? So, back to that, The Art of Narrative Analogy. This is actually a new book by a colleague and friend of mine that is really important, but also very accessible. You don't have to read Greek and Hebrew. If you want to dig into more of how certain narratives are shaped to be on analogy to other narratives, so that there's things linking and that becomes really important, grab this. It's excellent and it will help you with many portions of biblical literature. Okay, to wrap up here. This text and how Matthew presents Jesus as the great king and as the one to lead the people of God through a new and greater exodus. It makes me ask this question: how do we respond to the news that Jesus is the great king? Now, I am confident that none of us are going to respond with the animosity and hatred that Herod did, right? But are we happy in many areas to say, in many areas of our lives, yeah, Jesus is king and what he says goes. And then in other little areas, maybe Jesus is king, but I still want to do these certain things my way. Or something along those lines. Another angle on this, if Jesus has invited his people, and that includes us, into Exodus deliverance, into freedom, are we fully leaning in and living into that? Or are there areas of our lives where we have given up or decided to be okay with the status quo of, yeah, I know I'm still hurt in this area. I know I still struggle with this thing, but it just is what it is. Jesus, what he did, what he accomplished in his life, death, and resurrection, there is freedom, there is deliverance, there's restoration from sin and death. Now, it may not ever mean that any of us are perfect, but I believe that the resurrection power of Jesus and his Spirit in us can deliver us from a whole lot of stuff. You guys believe that? So maybe today, there's an area in your life that the Spirit is highlighting that you need to lean into in that regard. Maybe God's not content with just leaving a certain sin or a certain, something's not where you want it to be in your life, leaving it there at status quo. Maybe he has more deliverance, more healing, more freedom for you. So we're gonna spend a moment in prayer, and just whichever of those kind of angles on this text resonates with you, just take a moment, be present with God, see what he wants to speak to you, and then I'll close this out in prayer. So let's pray. Merciful God, one of the things that we gather to declare every week, but especially in the Advent season, is that your Son Jesus is the great King of all the universe. Would his rule and his reign be present and evident and manifest in our lives as well? And would it continue to grow in every area of our lives? And we thank you that through Jesus, your Son, that you have opened a way to new life, to a new freedom from bondage to sin and death. We thank you for the freedom and the deliverance that you have invited us into. Help us to lean into that and be partners with you in living that out in every area of our lives as we await for the final arrival of Jesus when he sets all things right and wipes every tear from every eye. That is our hope. That is our prayer. All God's people said, Amen. CCC, you are sent to be salt and light in a world that desperately needs Christ. Go in peace.